The United States, once the beacon of law and order, is facing a crime crisis of alarming proportions. From coast to coast, violent crime rates are on the rise, leaving communities shaken and raising concerns about the safety of everyday Americans. In cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and many others, crime has reached levels not seen in decades. Today, we explore the factors contributing to this surge in crime, the consequences for American society, and the efforts being made to combat this growing issue. Act 1. The rise of violent crime. The United States has long struggled with crime, but recent years have seen a sharp uptick in violence, particularly in major urban areas. From shootings to carjackings, robberies to homicides, the US has witnessed a disturbing rise in violent crime. According to FBI data, violent crime in the US increased by 10.5% in 2022 alone, with the murder rate continuing to climb. This marks a worrying trend, as cities that were once considered safe are now plagued by violence. In major cities like Chicago, the murder rate has soared to some of the highest levels in the country. In 2023, Chicago recorded over 700 homicides, marking a sharp rise from previous years. Similarly, cities such as New York and Los Angeles have seen significant spikes in violent crimes, especially gun violence, making headlines around the world. The streets that were once bustling with tourists and residents alike are now sites of fear and uncertainty. While crime rates initially dropped during the pandemic lockdowns, they surged again as restrictions were lifted. Many cities are now grappling with the aftermath, and the numbers are alarming. This trend shows no sign of slowing, and many are asking, why has America's crime rate increased so dramatically? Act 2. Gun violence, the driving force behind the crisis. One of the most significant drivers of the surge in crime in the United States is gun violence. The US has the highest rate of gun ownership in the world, and while firearms are deeply embedded in the nation's culture, this widespread access to guns has led to a dangerous increase in violent crime. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there were over 600 mass shootings in the United States in 2023 alone. In comparison to other countries, the US has seen a far greater incidence of gun-related violence, with over 40,000 deaths annually attributed to firearms. This epidemic of gun violence has had a direct impact on the crime rate. Criminals, particularly in urban areas, have easy access to firearms, which has made violent crime more lethal. From armed robberies to gang wars, gun violence has become the weapon of choice for criminals. The prevalence of firearms in the streets has led to an environment where disputes are resolved with deadly force rather than through dialogue or non-violent means. Moreover, the issue is compounded by the rise in gang activity, where criminal organizations are often heavily armed. Many of these gangs are involved in the drug trade, territorial disputes, and organized crime, all of which are fueled by the availability of guns. The ease with which criminals can acquire firearms has turned the streets of America into battlegrounds, where ordinary citizens fear for their lives. Act 3. The impact on society and daily life. The rising crime wave has had a profound effect on everyday Americans. People living in major cities are increasingly feeling unsafe, and the fear of violence has permeated communities across the country. In cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and St. Louis, residents have become accustomed to hearing sirens and the sounds of gunfire. This climate of fear has forced many citizens to alter their daily routines, avoid certain areas, and invest heavily in home security systems. In the aftermath of violent crimes, many communities face lasting trauma. Families are left grieving, businesses are forced to shut down or relocate, and schools and public spaces become potential sites for violence. People in high-crime neighborhoods are living under the constant shadow of crime with no escape in sight. The strain on the social fabric of American society is palpable, with communities divided, law enforcement stretched thin, and social cohesion eroded. The psychological toll of living in constant fear of crime cannot be understated. Studies have shown that exposure to violence can lead to long-term mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. For many, the fear of becoming a victim of crime is a daily reality, and the social and economic costs of this fear are mounting. Act 4. The underlying causes of America's crime surge. To understand why crime is on the rise in the US, we must examine the deeper societal issues that are fueling this surge in violence. While there is no single explanation, several factors contribute to America's crime crisis. Socioeconomic inequality. One of the major drivers of crime in the United States is socioeconomic inequality. The wealth gap in the US has been widening for decades, with the richest Americans accumulating more wealth while the middle class and poor have struggled to maintain a foothold. Poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to quality education create an environment in which crime thrives. In many urban centers, Young people in economically disadvantaged communities often see crime as the only way to escape poverty. In cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, neighborhoods plagued by poverty are also experiencing the highest levels of crime. With few job opportunities and inadequate social services, many individuals turn to crime to survive. The breakdown of family structures, lack of access to quality healthcare, and the absence of support systems make these communities vulnerable to the influences of criminal organizations, the opioid crisis. Another critical factor contributing to rising crime rates in the US is the opioid epidemic. The widespread addiction to opioids has created a public health crisis that has spilled over into the criminal justice system. Many individuals addicted to opioids resort to theft, robbery, and other crimes to feed their addiction. The opioid crisis has overwhelmed law enforcement and healthcare systems, contributing to a spike in drug-related crimes. As communities struggle to cope with the devastating effects of addiction, gang violence has risen as a result of the drug trade. The surge in drug trafficking has led to a rise in gang-related activity, particularly in areas where the demand for illicit substances is high. Law enforcement agencies are stretched thin, and resources that could be used to combat other types of crime are diverted to addressing the opioid epidemic. Lack of effective policing and criminal justice reform. Another contributing factor to the crime surge in the US is the ongoing debate over policing and criminal justice reform. While calls for police reform have gained momentum in the wake of incidents like the killing of George Floyd, there are concerns that cuts to police funding and a lack of resources for law enforcement are weakening the ability of police to effectively address crime. In many cities, police officers are undertrained and overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. Meanwhile, controversial policies such as bail reform have led to the release of repeat offenders, further fueling the crime wave. Act 5. Efforts to combat crime and restore order. The US government and local law enforcement agencies are scrambling to address the growing crime crisis, but solutions remain elusive. Many cities are focusing on increasing police presence and strengthening community policing efforts to build trust with residents. However, with tensions between law enforcement and certain communities at an all-time high, reform efforts are met with mixed reactions. Stronger gun control laws. The issue of gun violence is one of the primary areas of focus. Advocates for stricter gun control laws argue that the easy availability of firearms is a major factor contributing to the surge in violent crime. However, there is deep division in the US on this issue. While some states have enacted stricter gun laws, the federal government has struggled to pass comprehensive gun control legislation, largely due to opposition from gun rights advocates, community-based programs. In addition to law enforcement efforts, there are community-based programs aimed at addressing the root causes of crime. These programs focus on offering alternatives to at-risk youth, providing job training, education, and mentorship to help break the cycle of violence. Some cities have seen success with such initiatives, but these programs require significant investment and time to show results. Act 6. The road ahead. A nation at crossroads. Conclusion. The United States is at a crossroads. The rising tide of crime threatens to undo the progress made over decades, undermining public confidence in the nation's institutions and the rule of law. The question remains whether the country can address the root causes of this surge in violence or whether crime will continue to spiral out of control. As long as the deep divisions within American society persist, whether they be economic, racial, or political, finding a lasting solution to the crime crisis will remain elusive. The road ahead is uncertain, but the stakes could not be higher.